Everybody knows the wooden warplane of the Second World War. They built it out of plywood and balsa. It carried no armor worth the name, and it flew so fast that the fastest enemy fighters in the sky could not catch it. The de Havilland Mosquito, the wooden wonder. It is one of the most famous aircraft ever to fly, and it earned every bit of that fame. But here is the thing the comment section keeps shouting, and they are not wrong to shout it. Fame is not the same as winning a fight. The Mosquito got the legend. The Mosquito got the books and the documentaries and the airshow crowds. But when somebody asks which wooden fighter actually went up against the best single-seat fighters in the world, turned with them, outclimbed them, and shot them down, the answer is not British, it is Soviet. The real wooden beast was the La-5. That is the claim we are going to test today, all the way down to the rivets that were not even rivets, because half of these planes were held together with glue. We are going to put the Lavochkin La-5FN next to the de Havilland Mosquito and ask one simple question. Which wooden fighter actually ruled the fight it was built to win? And I will tell you right now, we are going to give the Mosquito full credit. More wood, more speed in some places, a brilliant machine. We are going to hand it everything it deserves. And then we are going to explain why, when the shooting started between fighters, the crown still went east. Let me show you how it all went down. 1941. The Soviet Union is on fire. The German invasion has torn through the Western republics, and the Soviet Air Force is being shot out of the sky in numbers that are hard to even say out loud. Whole regiments were wiped out on the ground in the first days, caught in neat rows before their pilots could even climb in. The machines that survived to fight back were often a generation behind what they were up against. And the fighters they had simply were not good enough. One of them was a little machine called the WWII, and pilots had a cruel nickname for it. They said, the letters stood for a guaranteed varnished coffin. It was made of wood, it was heavy, its engine was weak, and German pilots ate it alive. The thing flew like it was dragging an anchor, it bled speed, in every turn, it climbed like it was tired, and a pilot who got into a slow fight with a German single-seater, in one of these was often a dead man before he understood why. The men who flew it did not trust it, and they had earned the right not to. Now a normal air force scraps a plane like that. The Soviets could not. They were losing factories, losing aluminum, losing everything. And the one thing they had plenty of was timber, and the workers who knew how to shape it. The big aluminum plants were either overrun or torn off their foundations and loaded onto trains heading east, away from the front, to be rebuilt in the freezing open country beyond the Ural Mountains. You do not design a fighter around a metal you might not have next month. You design it around the pine forests you will always have. So the wood was not a clever idea. It was the hand the country had been dealt. So instead of throwing the wooden airframe away, a designer named Semyon Lavochkin made a bet. Keep the wood, keep the cheap, tough, forgiving wooden body that any furniture factory in the country could help build, but rip out the weak engine and bolt on something with real muscle. That bet became the La-5, and here is the part that almost nobody tells you. It very nearly did not happen at all. Lavochkin was at that moment a designer with a failing product and a target on his back. The varnished coffin was his airplane, and a state that was losing the war did not have a lot of patience for the man who built the coffin, so the work to save it was done quietly. The first conversion, the surgery that took a fat radial engine and married it to that doomed wooden body, was an almost unofficial side project worked on by a handful of people, 2 or 3 men, by some accounts, while the design bureau's official attention was pointed somewhere else. They were not supposed to be doing it. They did it anyway. That is how the most important Soviet fighter of the Middle War years got its start, as a quiet act of stubbornness by people who refused to let a good airframe die because of a bad engine. The muscle was a Shvetsov H-82, a 14-cylinder air-cooled radial. In its best wartime form, the H-82FN, it put out somewhere between 1,850 and nearly 2,000 horsepower. Sources argue over the exact figure, so we will give you the range and let it stand. But the point is not the number. The point is what that fat radial engine did to a wooden airframe that had been a flying coffin a year earlier. It turned it into a killer. Marrying that engine to that body was not as simple as swapping one box for another. The old inline engine was long and narrow, like the nose of a greyhound. The radial was a fat barrel of cylinders, much wider than the slim fuselage it was being grafted onto. The team had to fare the wide engine into the narrow body without ruining the airflow, manage the heat coming off 14 air-cooled cylinders, and balance the whole airplane around a heavier nose. They got the prototype into the air in March of 1942. By May it was approved for mass production. By the late summer and autumn of that year, the first production machines were rolling out and heading for the front. From a backroom side project to a frontline fighter in well under a year, in the middle of the worst military crisis the country had ever faced. And here is the part people forget. This was wood, not in some token way. The fuselage was wood. The wings were built around wood, pine in the early machines. Even the propeller, the Vish model that bit into the air out front, had wooden blades. You could walk up to a frontline Soviet fighter in 1943, a fighter that was about to go turn circles with the best the Luftwaffe had, and you could knock on it like a kitchen table. So why does nobody call the La-5 the wooden wonder? Pay attention to this next part, because it explains everything that follows. Because the Mosquito got there first, and the Mosquito did it with more style. Let us give the British their due, and I mean really give it to them, because the concession is what makes the verdict believable. Across the Channel, two men named Geoffrey de Havilland and R.E. Bishop had done something close to insane. They had walked into a war run by aluminum and steel, and they had proposed a fast bomber made almost entirely out of wood. The Air Ministry thought they were mad. A wooden bomber with no defensive gun turrets in 1939. It sounded like a step backward into the last war. They built it anyway with their own money in a manor house workshop, and they were right. The genius of it was the same genius the Soviets stumbled into, only chosen on purpose instead of forced by disaster. Britain's aircraft factories were jammed with orders and short on aluminum and short on the skilled metal workers to shape it. But Britain was full of cabinet makers, piano builders, and furniture firms, with woodworking shops standing half idle. A wooden airplane could be farmed out across the whole country, built in pieces by people who had never touched an aircraft, by men and women who knew timber and glue. So the Mosquito was not built only in aircraft plants. It was built by the people who made your grandmother's dining table and the upright piano in the parlour. That is part of why it earned its nicknames. The wooden wonder, yes, but the Germans on the receiving end had another name for it: the timber terror. The Mosquito's body was a moulded shell, a monocoque, which is a fancy word for a hollow wooden tube that carries its own load with no metal frame inside. They made it by sandwiching a core of Ecuadorian balsa wood between skins of Canadian birch plywood, pressing the whole thing in a concrete mould and gluing it together. The wing was a single piece of spruce and plywood that ran the entire span. Metal showed up only in the fittings, the bolts and brackets where things had to attach. And when it flew, it was, for a while, simply one of the fastest aircraft in the entire world. A bomber that left the fighters sent to stop it sitting in its slipstream. That is not a small thing to build out of glue and plywood. And it did real work with that speed. It went after the most precise targets of the war and hit them. Mosquito crews put bombs through the front doors of specific buildings, cracked open prison walls to free resistance fighters, and broke up enemy gatherings from rooftop height. No other aircraft was trusted with jobs that needed that kind of accuracy at that kind of speed. When the people who ran the air war wanted something impossible done in daylight and brought home, they sent the wooden one. So let us settle the first round honestly, because it matters. If the question is which plane was more wooden, by structural weight, by sheer volume of timber, doing the actual work of holding the aircraft together, the Mosquito wins. It is not close. The Mosquito is the most wooden combat aircraft that ever mattered. The La-5 used metal in more of its load-bearing structure, and used more of it as the war went on, with mostly metal construction coming in from 1944, as aluminum finally started flowing again from those rebuilt factories in the east. Round 1, the British. Write it down. Because we just handed the Mosquito the trophy it actually deserves. And it is going to make the next part land a lot harder. Here is where most people stop. They count the wood, they crown the Mosquito, they roll credits. But counting wood is not the question anybody actually cares about. The question is what each plane was built to do, and whether it did it against a thinking enemy who was trying to kill it. And the moment you ask that question, the two airplanes walk off in completely different directions. The Mosquito was built to run. That was its whole genius. It was a bomber that flew faster than fighters, so it did not need gun turrets or armor or a crew of gunners. It just outran the problem. In its fighter bomber form, the WWII, it carried 4 20mm Hispano cannon in the belly and 4.303 Browning machine guns in the nose, and that is a savage punch. But look at how it was meant to use that punch. It hit ground targets. It killed other bombers at night, slipping up on them in the dark with radar in its nose. It smashed railway yards and gun emplacements. It picked off ships. It flew photographs home from over enemy cities, and it went home before anybody could organize a response. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 engines, around 1460 to over 1600 horsepower each, depending on the mark, carried it along at roughly 380 to 390 miles an hour in the fighter bomber, and faster still in the high-altitude versions, over 400. It did all of it, and it did all of it well. Almost no other aircraft of the war could claim that range of jobs. What the Mosquito was never built to do was turn and burn with a single-seat fighter. Think about it for a second. It was a twin-engine aircraft the size of a light bomber, with 2 big engines hung out on the wings, and a crew of 2 sitting in a wooden tube. You do not take that into a knife fight against a nimble little single-seater and expect to win the turning contest. The physics will not let you. A heavy twin cannot rotate around a tight circle the way a light single-seater can, and the moment it tries, it bleeds the speed that was keeping it alive in the first place. You are not supposed to be in the turning contest at all. If a Mosquito ended up dogfighting an enemy fighter, something had already gone wrong. Its survival plan was speed, and speed away from the fight, not speed into it. The La-5 was the exact opposite animal. It was the knife. The La-5FN was a single-seat frontline day fighter, and it had one job above all others. Go to where the German fighters were, below 20,000 feet, where the entire Eastern Front air war was actually being fought, and beat them. Not outrun them, beat them, outturn them, outclimb them, get on their tail and stay there. 2 20mm Schwack cannon, 170 rounds per gun, and when needed a pair of 220-pound bombs for work against the ground. But the cannon were the point. This was a machine designed to put 2 heavy autocannon onto a German fighter in a turning fight and tear it apart. A short burst from a pair of 20mm cannon does not wound an airplane. It takes pieces off it. And that is a completely different test of an aircraft. Running away is an engineering problem. You solve it with horsepower and a clean shape. Winning a dogfight is a brawl, and the brawl is where reputations are actually made or lost. The brawl punishes every flaw. It punishes a slow climb, a heavy turn, an engine that hesitates, a pilot who cannot see behind him. There is nowhere to hide in a turning fight at 5,000 feet. So let us send them both to the brawl and see who is still standing. If you are getting something out of this breakdown, do me a favor and subscribe. We go deep on the machines that actually decided this war, the ones the popular histories skip right over, and there is a lot more coming. 1943, the brawl. By the summer of that year, the German fighter arm in the east was flying 2 superb single-seat fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109G and the Focke-Wulf FW 190A. These were not easy marks. The 109G was a fast, hard-climbing thoroughbred, the latest in a line that had been killing Soviet pilots since the first morning of the invasion. The 190A was a brutal, heavily armed brick of a fighter that could dive away from almost anything, and came back swinging, with a battery of guns that could break an aircraft in a single pass. For 2 years, Soviet fighters had met these two and come off worse. The German pilots expected to win, and usually they did. Some of them had personal scores running into the hundreds. Going up against that was not a fair fight. It was a slaughter with a date on it. Then the La-5FN showed up in numbers, and the math changed. Here is what the testing said, and this is the heart of the whole video, so let it land. When Soviet engineers put a captured German fighter and the new La-5 Live through the same trials, the same conditions, the same instruments, the Lavochkin came out ahead where it counted. Below 20,000 feet, it was faster than the Bf-109G. Below 16,000 feet, it climbed better. And in horizontal maneuverability, the flat-turning fight, the exact contest a dogfight comes down to, it beat the 109 at every altitude they tested. Against the FW-190A, the heavier German fighter, the La-5FN turned tighter and climbed a touch quicker. The top speed, by the way, came in right around 403 miles an hour up at 20,000 feet. Fast enough to stay in the fight, and far better than fast where the fight actually was. Read that again. A wooden fighter, grown out of a plane that pilots had called a varnished coffin 2 years before, was now out-turning and out-climbing the best single-seat fighters the Luftwaffe could put over the front. And there was a trick under the cowling that made it even meaner. That ASH-82FN engine was fuel-injected. The letters FN told you so. The Merlins in the Mosquito and in the British Spitfire used carburetors, at least in their early forms, and a carbureted engine has an ugly habit. Shove the nose down hard, pull negative G, and the fuel sloshes the wrong way, and the engine coughs and loses power for a second. In a fight, a second is a lifetime. A second is the difference between the man who fires and the man who gets fired on. The fuel-injected Soviet radial did not care. Push it negative, fly it inverted, throw it around the sky in any direction you liked, and it kept making power the whole time. The German fighters had injection too, which is one big reason they were so dangerous, and had owned the sky so long. The La-5FN had finally given the Soviets an engine that would not flinch in a brawl. It closed the last gap that had been getting their pilots killed. This is the first Soviet fighter that could meet the 109 and the 190 on genuinely equal terms down low. Equal at worst, better in the turn. That had never been true before. Not once, not in 2 years of fighting. For the first time, a Soviet pilot could climb into the cockpit and know that the airplane was not the thing that would lose the fight for him. There was one more thing the La-5FN gave its pilots that does not show up in a speed chart. It was forgiving. A green pilot, and the Soviets were throwing a lot of green pilots into the sky by 1943, could haul it around hard without it, suddenly snapping out of control and killing him. It warned you before it quit on you. For an air force that was training men fast and losing them faster, an airplane that did not punish a beginner's mistakes with death was worth almost as much as raw performance. It let an average pilot fight like a good one and survive long enough to become a good one. Was it perfect? No, and we are not going to pretend it was, because the honest version is the convincing version. Above 20,000 feet, up in the thin air, where strategic bombers and their escorts fought in the west, the La-5FN ran out of breath. Its supercharging could not keep the radial happy that high, and up there the German fighters got their advantage back. The early cockpits were also genuinely miserable. The big air-cooled engine baked the pilot like he was sitting on a stove. Ventilation was poor, and worse, exhaust fumes could leak into the cockpit, badly enough that pilots sometimes flew with the canopy cracked open just to breathe and stay cool. Imagine fighting for your life against a German ace while half choking on your own engine's fumes. Nobody who flew one would call it comfortable. But here is the thing about that high-altitude weakness. It did not matter, because the war the La-5 was built to fight did not happen up there. It happened low, over the steppe, over the tank battles, over the mud, in the first 15 or 20,000 feet of sky. The Eastern Front was a war of armies and ground, and the airplanes mostly fought down where the armies were, hunting tanks and trucks and the enemy fighters protecting them. That is where the Eastern Front was decided, and that is exactly the band of altitude the La-5FN owned. Faulting it for its thin air performance is like faulting a boxer because he is not a good swimmer. He was never going to be in the water. And then came the test that put it in the history books. July 1943, Kursk. The largest clash of armour the world had ever seen, thousands of tanks grinding into each other across a stretch of open country, and above the tanks an air battle to match it. The sky was thick with airplanes. This was the moment the La-5FN arrived in real numbers. Flown by Soviet pilots who finally had a machine that could fight back on even footing. For 2 years they had been the hunted. Now, for the first time on this scale, they could hunt. And the sky over Kursk is where the long German grip on the Eastern Front air war started to come loose. And the fighting up there was not gentle. Pilots came home with their wooden skins shredded by cannon fire, with holes you could put your arm through, and the planes flew again the next morning because a torn wooden panel could be patched by a man with glue and a saw far faster than a buckled aluminum one could be cut out and replaced. The cheapness of the wood, the very thing that had once felt like an insult, turned into a quiet strength when the airplanes started coming home, hurt in large numbers. You can rebuild a forest. You cannot conjure aluminum out of the ground in a week. Historians put it plainly. The mass arrival of the La-5FN at Kursk in July 1943 marked the beginning of the end of German air superiority in the East, not the end. The beginning of the end. The Luftwaffe did not vanish from the sky that month, but the trend that started over those tank fields only ever ran one direction after that, and a wooden Soviet fighter was a big part of why. The men in those cockpits could feel it changing under them. And the men matter here, because a machine is only as good as the hands on the stick. The greatest fighter pilot the Allies produced in the entire war flew this airplane. Ivan Kozhedub scored his victories in the La-5FN and then in its successor, and he ended the war as the top-scoring Allied ace of all, with somewhere around 62 to 64 enemy aircraft to his name. Every one of those kills was earned in the same band of low and medium altitude this wooden fighter was built to rule. The best the Allies had, flying the plane the comments are fighting about. That is not a coincidence. They built somewhere around 9,900 to 10,000 La-5s of all types, before the line moved on to its even deadlier successor. Of those, about 5,047 were the FN, the fuel-injected frontline model we have been talking about. 5,000 wooden knife fighters, thrown into the worst air fighting on Earth, and they came out the other side having helped break an enemy that 2 years earlier had owned the sky. For comparison, they built around 7,700 Mosquitoes of every type across the whole war. 2 wooden airplanes, built in their thousands, on opposite ends of the same continent, for 2 completely different wars. So let us bring both planes back and settle this for good. The Mosquito flew faster in the places it chose to fly. The Mosquito was more wooden by a clear margin. The Mosquito did more different jobs: bombing, night fighting, photo reconnaissance, ship hunting, and did all of them brilliantly across Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and Southeast Asia. The Mosquito is, no argument, one of the greatest aircraft of the entire war. And it had its own wooden weakness, by the way, because that glued structure could fail in the wet tropical heat of the Far East, where the original casein glue did not hold up to the damp and the rot, and had to be replaced with a tougher formaldehyde glue before airframes started coming apart. Wood was a gamble for everyone who built with it, British and Soviet alike. The forest does not care which flag you fly. But the Mosquito won by not fighting. It survived because nothing could catch it, and the day something did catch it, it was in trouble because dogfighting single-seaters was never its job, never its design, never its plan. Take nothing away from it. Just be honest about what it was. The La-5 had exactly one job: climb into the same patch of sky as the best single-seat fighters in the world, turn with them and kill them. And it did that job. Against the Bf-109G and the FW-190A, down where the war was real, it gave as good as it got, and often better. It walked into the brawl the Mosquito was built to avoid, and it won. So when somebody asks which wooden fighter ruled, you have to ask, ruled at what? If the question is, which wooden plane was the cleverest piece of engineering? Fine, take the Mosquito, it has earned it 100 times over. But if the question is the one the comments keep asking, which wooden fighter actually went toe-to-toe with the enemy's best and won the fight it was built for, there is only one answer. It was not the famous one. It was not the British one. It was a plane grown out of a flying coffin, saved by 2 or 3 stubborn men in a back room, built from pine and plywood and a propeller you could carve in a workshop, flown by pilots roasting in the cockpit